The train lurched to a halt at Bitter Creek, Wyoming, its whistle shrieking through the biting wind. Snowflakes swirled like restless spirits around the iron beast, steam hissing from its flanks in thick, white clouds that dissolved into the dusk. Eliza Gray stepped onto the splintered wooden platform, her worn boots crunching against a crust of ice and snow. She clutched a small canvas bag to her chest, her breath fogging in the frigid air, her dark eyes scanning the quiet town. A fragile hope flickered in her heart, tempered by the weight of a journey that had taken her from a crumbling Kansas farm across miles of frostbitten plains. She could hear the groan of the train's brakes, the rattle of shop signs swaying in the wind, the distant bark of a strayed dog echoing off clapboard buildings, the soft clink of a saloon's piano drifting through the cold. But her voice was gone, stolen at 10 when a fall from a barn loft crushed her throat, leaving her mute. She spoke through signs, scribbled notes, and the way her gaze caught every fleeting detail, weaving a world from sound and sight, a tapestry of observation that had kept her alive. The platform was nearly deserted, the few passengers hurrying toward the warmth of lamplit homes or the saloon's smoky haze. Eliza adjusted her threadbare scarf, her fingers stiff and red from the cold, and trudged toward the saloon, where Caleb Warwick, her promised husband, was supposed to meet her. His letters had been her lifeline, words of a sturdy home, a shared life, a place where she could belong, penned in a careful hand that had felt like a promise. She'd read them by candlelight in her family's drafty attic, dreaming of a future beyond the pitying stares of neighbors and the silence that had defined her since childhood. As she approached the saloon, its swinging doors creaking in the wind, a broad man in a heavy gray coat leaned against the wall, a cigar glowing between his gloved fingers. He was stockier than she'd pictured, with a weathered face, a patchy beard, and eyes cold as the frost underfoot. His hat was pulled low, casting a shadow over a scowl that deepened as she stopped a few steps away. Eliza smoothed her faded blue dress, its hem frayed from the journey, and offered a small smile, her heart thudding. She raised her hand in a gentle wave, her way of saying, "I'm here. I'm ready." Caleb's brow furrowed, his cigar dropping ash into the snow. "You don't talk," he said, his voice sharp, cutting through the wind. She nodded, touching her throat and then her lips, a gesture she perfected over a decade. Most folks caught on fast, their faces softening with curiosity or pity. Caleb's mouth tightened into a thin line, his eyes narrowing. "You're mute?" he said, louder, as if she couldn't hear. She nodded again, her smile faltering under his stare, her hope flickering like a candle in a draft. She reached into her bag, fingers brushing past a worn notebook and a tarnished ring, her mother's only keepsake, and pulled out his letter, the paper creased from countless readings. It had promised a warm hearth, a partnership, a new beginning. She held it out, her hand steady despite the cold. He barely glanced at it, his lip curling. "You didn't mention that." She shook her head, pulling out her own letter to show she had. She'd written plainly, her words chosen with care. "I lost my voice at 10. I hear, I read lips I write and sign. I can be a good wife. I can care deeply." Caleb snatched it, skimmed a line, then tore it in half, letting the pieces fall into the slush. "A man like me needs a wife who can answer when I call, not some silent girl who stares like a lost dog," he spat. A couple of men lounging on the saloon's porch snickered, one slapping his knee, muttering something foul that made the other laugh harder, their voices grating against the wind. A woman in a bonnet shuffled by, clutching a basket, her eyes flicking to Eliza before darting away, as if shame were contagious. A boy kicking a tin can pause to stare, then ran off when his mother called. Eliza's face burned, her cheeks stinging from more than the cold, but she stood tall, her hands tightening around her bag until her knuckles whitened. Caleb kept talking, his words sharp, his hands waving her off like a stray. I ain't tying myself to a woman who can't even say my name. Find yourself a quiet fool to marry, he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. Then he grabbed her bag, her only belongings, a few clothes, her notebook, the ring, and flung it into the muddy snow beside the saloon. It landed with a wet thud, the canvas soaking through, the weight of his rejection sinking deeper than the cold. The men on the porch howled, one spitting into the snow, their laughter a knife in her chest. She stared at the bag, then at the man who'd lured her here with kind words only to shatter them with cruelty. No one stepped forward. The snickering men lit new cigars, their laughter curling like smoke. The woman in the bonnet hurried away, her footsteps fading. A shopkeeper across the street swept his porch, his broom scraping rhythmically, pretending not to see. The boy with the tin can peek from an alley, then vanished. Eliza knelt, her fingers trembling as she lifted her bag and brushed off the snow. The canvas was heavy, sodden, but she held it close, her jaw set. She wouldn't cry, not here, not for them. She stood, chin high, and walked away, the saloon's laughter fading behind her, replaced by the wind's mournful howl. Her boots crunched as she passed the town's edge, moving toward the dark line of pines under a steel-gray sky. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't stay in a place that saw her as less than whole. The cold deepened, the wind slicing through her thin coat like a blade. Her hands numbed, her lips chapped and cracked, stinging with every breath. She kept walking, one step after another, though the path was barely a trail, winding into the hills, the snow piling higher with each gust. The road stretched empty. No carts, no travelers, just the moan of wind and the creak of bare branches overhead, their shadows dancing across the snow. Her shawl offered little warmth as she stumbled on, the weight of rejection heavier than the snow clinging to her hem. Her breath came in shallow bursts, her legs growing heavy, each step a battle against the cold and her own sinking heart. She'd left everything behind, her family's farm, her few friends, the life she'd known, for a promise that had crumbled in minutes. Her father's last words, gruff and final, echoed in her mind. You're on your own now. Her mother, long gone, had been her shield, teaching her to read lips, to sign, to hold her head high. But here, in the vast white, she felt small, her hope fraying like her dress. She tripped, falling to her knees with a soft gasp, her bag slipping from her grip. The snow was soft but unforgiving, soaking through her dress, chilling her to the bone. She pushed to stand, but her strength was fading, the cold seeping into her core. Her vision blurred, the trees swaying like shadows in a dream. She sank back, her hands clutching the snow, her breath hitching. The world felt distant, the wind's howl softening to a whisper. She thought of her mother's hands, guiding hers to form signs, of firelit nights when she'd felt whole. But here, surrender seemed close, the cold whispering her name. Then she heard the crunch of boots, sharp against the snow's quiet. A figure moved through the storm, leading a horse, its breath steaming in the air. She looked up, heart pounding, as a man knelt beside her. His face was rough, lined by years of sun and wind, with eyes like faded steel under a wide-brimmed hat. He wore a worn leather coat, his hands calloused but gentle as he touched her shoulder. You're freezing, he said, his voice low and urgent. She heard the worry in his tone, felt the warmth of his hands through her shawl. He lifted her gently, smelling of pine, sawdust, and faint wood smoke. She tensed, then sagged against him, too weak to resist. He wrapped his coat around her and carried her to his horse, settling her in the saddle before climbing up behind her. His arms steadied her, his chest a solid warmth against her back. The horse moved forward, the world a haze of snow and shadow. A thought sparked in her fading mind. Maybe some people stay. The horse plodded through the storm, Bitter Creek's lights vanishing behind them, swallowed by the snow. Snow stung Nathan Holt's face as he held the trembling woman close. She was too light, too still, her breath shallow against his chest, her hands limp around her sodden bag. He didn't know her story, but he'd seen enough broken dreams in these hills to guess. A small bag, a dress too thin for winter, a face too proud to plead. As a carpenter, he'd built tables, chairs, and even a church pew for Bitter Creek, his work steadying him through years of loss. His sister, Clara, had been his anchor, her laughter filling their cabin until fever took her 3 years back. Her absence left a silence he couldn't fill, a weight he carried in every swing of his hammer. He urged the horse toward his home, a low, sturdy cabin in a clearing, its windows glowing faintly, a workshop nearby stacked with lumber and tools, the air sharp with the scent of cut pine. He carried Eliza inside, the fire's heat washing over them like a wave, chasing the cold from their bones. He set her on a woven rug by the hearth, draping a thick wool blanket over her shoulders, its edges frayed but warm. He filled a tin mug with hot tea from a kettle and pressed it into her hands, his fingers brushing hers, cold as ice. She blinked, her eyes clearing, and sipped slowly, color creeping back in her cheeks, her lips trembling as warmth returned. Nathan sat across from her, studying her, his elbows resting on his knees. He noticed how she tilted her head to catch the firelight, how her gaze flicked to his lips when he spoke, reading him as easily as a book. "You hurt." She shook her head, touched her throat, and made a small gesture. No voice. He nodded, his brow creasing, understanding settling in. "Can't speak." She nodded again, then pulled a crumpled notebook from her bag, its pages warped from snow. She wrote in quick, neat strokes, her hand steady despite the faint shake, and handed it to him. "I'm Eliza Gray. I can't speak, but I hear and read lips. I use signs and write. I came to marry a man in town, but he turned me away when he learned I was mute." Nathan read it twice, his jaw tight, anger flickering for a man he didn't yet know, a man who'd cast her out into the cold. "That's a low thing to do," he said, setting the note down, his voice rough but kind. "You're safe here, Eliza. Rest as long as you need." Her shoulders eased, just a fraction, her eyes holding his for a moment longer than necessary, a spark of gratitude in their depths. And something else, resilience unbowed. He stood, bolting the door against the wind, which howled like a living thing, rattling the shutters and clawing at the walls. He poured 2 mugs of coffee, handed her one, and sat again, the fire casting shadows across his weathered face, his hands cradling the mug as if it could anchor him. "Got family waiting for you." She shook her head, signed something he didn't follow, her hands moving like a dance, then wrote, "No one. I came for a new start. It's gone now." Nathan leaned back, his calloused fingers tracing the mug's rim, his eyes steady on hers. "New starts don't end that easy. You're still here, ain't you?" Eliza stayed that night, sleeping on a cot Nathan set up near the fire, the blanket tucked around her like a cocoon. The next morning, she woke to the smell of bacon sizzling and the rhythmic thud of an axe outside, splitting wood with steady precision. She dressed quickly, her hands still sore from the cold, her dress stiff with dried mud. She stepped onto the porch, the air sharp but softer than the night before. The clearing was quiet, snow blanketing the ground, the workshop's roof sagging slightly under the weight, a pile of fresh-cut logs stacked neatly nearby. Nathan looked up, his axe pausing mid-swing, a faint smile breaking through his gruff exterior. "Morning," he said, his breath clouding, his flannel shirt rolled up despite the chill. She waved, then pointed to the cabin, signing a question, her hands fluid, practiced, a language Nathan found himself wanting to learn. He caught her meaning, his brow lifting. "You want to help with breakfast?" She nodded, and they worked together, her slicing bread with a careful hand while he fried eggs, the kitchen filling with warmth and the clatter of pans. She wrote notes to suggest adding herbs, her handwriting small and precise. And Nathan found himself smiling at her quiet efficiency, the way she moved like she'd always been there, her presence a steady note in the cabin's quiet song. Days turned into weeks, and Eliza didn't leave. Nathan didn't ask her to, and the question of her departure hung unspoken, fading with each shared meal, each moment of companionship. She found ways to make herself useful, mending a torn curtain with neat stitches, sanding a chair Nathan was building, her hands learning the wood's grain as if it were language. She sketched designs for a new table, clean lines, a carved vine along the edge, that made Nathan pause and nod in approval, his calloused fingers tracing her work. "This'll sell," he said, and she flushed, her eyes bright. One evening, she showed him a sketch of the cabin at dusk, the chimney smoke curling into a pink sky, the axe leaning against a stump, the workshop's open door revealing a glimpse of tools, the clearing framed by pines. "You've got a gift," he said, turning the page in his hands, genuinely impressed. She shrugged, her cheeks pink, then wrote, "I see things. I hold them here." She tapped her temple, her eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity, a strength that ran deeper than words. He saw not just a woman down on her luck, but someone with a mind sharp as a blade, a heart that hadn't broken despite the world's best efforts. Nathan's cabin, once a place of routine and solitude, began to feel alive again, its walls warmed by more than the fire. Eliza's presence was quiet but steady, like the heartbeat of the hearth that never went out. She taught him a few signs: "Thank you, good, home," and he practiced them clumsily, his large hands stumbling over the gestures, earning her rare, soft smiles that lit her face like dawn, a sight that caught him off guard, stirring something he hadn't felt since Claire's days. One night, as they sat by the hearth, the wind rattling the windows, Nathan spoke quietly, his voice rough but warm. "Clara, my sister, used to sit right where you are." She'd hum while she knitted, said it kept her hands steady. "Fever took her 3 years ago, left a hole nothing could fill." Eliza watched his lips, her eyes gentle, catching every word, her hands still in her lap. She wrote, "I know empty, but you've given me full." He read it, his throat tight, the words sinking deep, carving a place in him. "You're giving it back," he said, and meant it, his gaze lingering on her, seeing the woman who'd walked through a storm and still stood. Their routine was simple but grounding, a rhythm that grew with each day. Eliza helped in the workshop, learning to carve small patterns into wood, leaves, flowers, a tiny bird, her hands steady despite their slenderness. Nathan taught her how to measure lumber, how to feel for flaws in the grain, his voice patient as he guided her, his hand brushing hers when he adjusted her grip on a chisel. She listened to his stories, tales of building barns in summer heat, of Clara's laugh that could charm a grouchy mule, of the time he nearly lost a finger to a saw and cursed loud enough to scare the crows. Eliza shared her own past in notes and signs. A childhood on a Kansas farm, the accident that silenced her when she fell through a rotten loft, the years of being overlooked, underestimated, pushed to the edges of every room. She told him of her mother, who'd taught her to read lips and sign, her hands patient and sure, and her father, who'd grown distant after her injury, as if her silence were a fault he couldn't forgive. Nathan listened, his silence not judgment but space for her to fill, his eyes steady, seeing her as she was. Eliza found joy in the small things, kneading dough for bread, watching the way Nathan's hands shaped wood with a craftsman's care, the sound of birds returning as winter loosened its grip. She began to carve her own pieces, wooden spoons, a small box with a floral pattern, a set of drawer pulls shaped like oak leaves. Her work drawing notice when Nathan took it to town. A shopkeeper, a gruff man named Amos, offered to sell her carvings, his eyes widening at the detail in her work. "Folks'll pay for this," he said, holding up a spoon she'd etched with vines. Eliza hesitated, her fingers twisting in her apron, but Nathan encouraged her, his hand on her shoulder. "They see what you can do," he said. "Let him." She nodded, a spark of pride in her eyes, and wrote, "It's mine to give." For the first time, she felt like more than a guest in his world. She was building her own, piece by piece. But Bitter Creek wasn't done with its grudges. Caleb Warwick's rejection had spread through the town like wildfire, his wounded pride fueling gossip that clung like damp rot. Whispers followed Nathan when he delivered furniture. Talk of the mute girl he'd taken in, questions about his intentions, snide remarks about a man alone with a woman who couldn't speak. Some called it charity, others called it folly. A few, bitter men who drank with Caleb, called it something uglier. Nathan ignored them, his jaw set, his hammer striking nails with more force than needed. But Eliza saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands tightened when he returned from town, the way he checked the door's bolt twice each night. She wrote one evening, as they sat by the fire, "They talk about me. I'm trouble for you." Nathan read it, his eyes hard, his mouth a firm line. "They talk because they got nothing better. You ain't trouble. You're home." The word hung between them, heavy with meaning, and she reached for his hand, her fingers trembling but sure, her eyes shining with something new. Trust, fragile but growing. The town's whispers weren't the only threat. Caleb's pride, bruised and festering, had turned to something darker. He'd been seen in the saloon, drinking heavily, muttering about being cheated, about Nathan stealing what was his. Nathan heard the rumors from Amos, who'd overheard Caleb's rants and sent word to the deputy, a slow-moving man named Barrett who promised to keep an eye out. But Wyoming winters were long, and grudges grew like weeds. Eliza sensed the shift, too, her eyes catching the way Nathan scanned the horizon when he chopped wood, the way he kept a mallet within reach even in the workshop. She wrote, "He's not done with me." Nathan nodded, his hand covering hers. "He ain't done, but he ain't welcome here. We'll handle it." His voice was steady, but his eyes held a storm of their own. Trouble came for real one night, as snow fell thick and heavy, blanketing the clearing in silence. A sharp thud echoed outside, cutting through the cabin's warmth, followed by the crunch of boots, deliberate and heavy. Nathan froze, his fork halfway to his mouth, the firelight flickering across his face. Eliza, rinsing a plate, turned, hearing the sound. A step, then another too close. She saw Nathan's shoulders tense, his eyes narrowing to slits. "Stay put," he mouthed, his voice low, barely a whisper. She nodded, drying her hands, her heart racing, her ears straining for every sound. The creak of snow, the faint jingle of a spur. Nathan grabbed a stout wooden mallet from his workbench, its handle worn smooth from years of use, and moved to the window. Through the frosted glass, he saw 3 figures approaching on foot, their lantern casting long shadows across the snow, the light glinting off metal at their hips. One swayed, reeking of liquor, his steps uneven. They weren't here for a friendly visit. Nathan stepped onto the porch, mallet in hand, the cold stinging his face, the wind carrying the scent of whiskey and sweat. He stood tall, his shadow long against the cabin's wall, the mallet steady in his grip. He recognized Caleb Warwick at once, broad, mean, and full of himself, his coat dusted with snow, his eyes glinting with spite, a knife at his belt and a bottle sway in his stance. "Halt," Caleb called, stopping just beyond the gate, his voice slurred but sharp, cutting through the storm. "You're hiding what's mine." Nathan gripped the mallet tighter, his stance wide, his voice steady. "She ain't yours. Never was." Caleb's face twisted, his hand hovering near his knife, his words venomous. "She was promised to me. Signed a contract. Then she shamed me in front of everyone, playing the poor mute girl. Nathan didn't flinch, his eyes locked on Caleb's. You shamed yourself, tossing her out like trash. One of Caleb's men shifted, his hand on a knife, his face half hidden by a scarf, his eyes darting nervously. The other smirked, cracking his knuckles, his boots scuffing the snow, a revolver tucked into his belt. Caleb stepped closer, his breath sour, his voice rising. Hand her over, or we'll take her. You ain't got no claim. Nathan's voice was low, unyielding, each word deliberate. You step on my land, you'll regret it. The air hung heavy, sharp as a blade, the snow falling silent around them, the lantern's light flickering. Caleb sneered, his lip curling, his hand twitching toward his knife. You'll fight for a woman who can't even call your name? You're a fool, Holt. Caleb lunged, swinging a fist, his movements sloppy from drink, his knife half drawn. Nathan sidestepped, swinging the mallet to clip Caleb's shoulder, the impact solid, sending a jolt through his arm. Caleb grunted, stumbling into the snow, cursing loudly, his knife clattering to the ground. One of his men rushed forward, his own knife glinting in the lantern's light, but Eliza, who'd slipped out the back and grabbed a heavy piece of firewood from the pile, swung it hard, catching Caleb's arm as he tried to stand. He howled, dropping to one knee, clutching his shoulder, his face contorted in pain, the knife buried in the snow. Nathan spun, stunned, his eyes meeting hers for a split second. Her face pale but fierce, her grip on the firewood steady, her breath fogging in quick bursts. He swung again, knocking the second man flat, the crack of wood against bone echoing in the clearing, the man's revolver skidding across the ice. The first man, seeing Caleb wounded and his friend down, scrambled backward, tripping in the snow, his scarf falling as he bolted, disappearing into the dark, his lantern abandoned, its flame guttering out. It was over in seconds, the clearing silent again, except for Caleb's groans and the wind's low moan. Nathan turned to Eliza, who stood, firewood still in hand, her eyes wide but unyielding, her chest heaving. He dropped the mallet and pulled her close, his arms tight around her, his heart pounding against her cheek, his breath ragged with relief. "You're all right," he murmured, knowing she could hear, his voice rough but warm. Caleb groaned in the snow, cursing, his arm limp, his pride as broken as a shoulder, but Nathan ignored him. He'd sent word to the deputy about Caleb's threats after hearing rumors in town. Help would come soon enough, Barrett's slow pace be damned. They left Caleb where he fell, his complaints swallowed by the wind, and returned to the cabin, the door shutting out the cold and the chaos, the fire's glow a promise of safety. Inside, Eliza's hand shook as she set the firewood down, her knees buckling slightly, the adrenaline draining from her. Nathan knelt beside her, his hand on her shoulder, steadying her, his eyes searching hers. "You stopped him," he said, making sure she saw his lips, his voice firm but gentle. She shook her head, tears welling, her fingers signing no, frantic, her hands trembling. "You did," he insisted, his hand catching hers, grounding her. "You fought for us." She reached for her notebook, her movements jerky, and wrote, her hand shaking, "For you. For this." I couldn't let him take it. He read it, his chest tight, the words carving a place in him, deeper than any wound. He pulled her close again, her head resting against his shoulder, her breath slowing as the fire's warmth seeped into them. They sat there, the silence between them warm, full of things neither needed to say, the crackle of the fire the only sound, a steady pulse in the night. The deputy arrived at dawn, his horse's hooves muffled by the fresh snow, his lantern casting a weak glow. He hauled Caleb away, still muttering threats, but too battered to fight, his arms swollen and useless, his ego bruised worse than his body. The other man was rounded up later, found hiding in a barn, shivering and swearing. Nathan and Eliza stood on the porch, snow falling softly around them, the world quiet again, The clearing untouched except for the trampled snow where the fight had been, the abandoned lantern half buried. "I ain't been that scared since I was a boy," Nathan said, a half-smile breaking through, his breath clouding, his hand resting on the porch rail. Eliza touched her chest, signed something quick, her hands fluid, then wrote in her notebook, "Courage isn't fearless. It's acting despite fear." He read it, then pressed her hand to his lips, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin, his eyes soft. "You're braver than most," he said, his voice low, and she smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached her eyes and stayed, warming him more than the fire ever could. Weeks passed, and Eliza's place in the cabin grew permanent. Not a question, but a truth. She carved intricate patterns into Nathan's furniture. Vines, flowers, small birds, a crescent moon. Her designs drawing customers from town who marveled at the work, paying good coin for a chair, a box, or a set of spoons she touched. Amos, the shopkeeper, displayed her carvings in his window, his gruff praise a rare thing. "This girl's got magic in her hands." Eliza flushed at the words, but Nathan beamed, his pride in her quiet but fierce. She taught him more signs, work, happy, together, and he taught her how to plane wood smooth as glass, his hands guiding hers over the tools, their laughter filling the workshop when she accidentally shaved too much from board. They laughed over small things, spilled coffee, a warped plank, the way the cabin's roof creaked in the wind like an old man complaining, its groans a familiar song. Eliza began to write longer notes, sharing memories of Kansas summers, of her mother's garden where lavender grew wild, of fireflies lighting the fields at dusk like stars come to earth. She wrote of her brother, who'd left for the mines and never returned, and her father, whose silence after her accident had cut deeper than the injury itself. Nathan shared his own stories. Clara's knack for fixing anything broken, from a chair to a neighbor's mood. The time he built a table for a widow who paid him in apple pies that tasted like heaven. The quiet pride of seeing his work in homes across the county. He told her of his childhood, running wild in these hills, and the day he realized carpentry was his calling. The feel of wood under his hands a language he understood. Their evenings became a ritual of stories, shared over coffee or stew, the fire casting their shadows on the walls, their voices, one spoken, one signed, blending into something whole. Spring came slowly, the snow melting into mud, the pines brightening with new green, the air sharp with the promise of growth. Eliza's carvings became known beyond Bitter Creek, orders coming from as far as Laramie, Cheyenne, even a merchant in Denver who'd heard of the silent artist through a traveler. She and Nathan worked side by side, their days filled with the rhythm of saws and hammers, the scent of fresh-cut wood, the clink of tools against nails. Their evenings were quieter, spent on the porch as the sky turned gold, Eliza's sketching while Nathan whittled, their silence comfortable, their laughter quick. She began to experiment, carving larger pieces, a headboard with a forest scene, a mantelpiece etched with rolling hills, her confidence growing with each finished work. Nathan watched her, his heart swelling at the way she claimed her space, her hands telling stories her voice never could. But the world outside their clearing wasn't always kind. Bitter Creek's gossip lingered, though it softened as Eliza's work spread. Some still whispered about her silence, about Nathan's choice, about a woman who fought with firewood and won. A few, loyal to Caleb's memory, spat when Nathan passed, their resentment a low hum. Caleb himself had been run out of town, his arm healed, but his reputation ruined, his threats empty now that Barrett kept a closer watch. Nathan and Eliza ignored the whispers, their focus on their work, their home, each other. But Eliza carried a quiet fear, one she rarely voiced, that her presence might bring more trouble, that her silence might one day cost Nathan more than he could bear. She wrote one night, her hand hesitant, "If I bring harm, I'll go." Nathan read it, his face darkening, and took her hand, his grip firm. "You're my home, Eliza. Ain't no harm bigger than losing that." She nodded, tears in her eyes, and signed stay, her hands steady, her heart sure. One afternoon, as spring bloomed into summer, they sat in the workshop, sanding a table together, the air thick with sawdust and sunlight. Nathan paused, wiping sweat from his brow, his eyes on her. "You ever think about staying for good?" he asked, his voice careful, his hands still on the wood. She stopped, her sanding block poised, and wrote, "I'm here, aren't I?" He chuckled, but his gaze was serious, his voice dropping. "I mean forever, Eliza. Not just the cabin. Us." Her breath caught, her heart racing. She set the block down, her hands trembling, and signed home, then pointed to him, her eyes bright with feeling. He nodded, understanding, but pressed on, his words halting but sure. "I ain't good with words, but I know what I feel. I want this us to be real. Always." Her eyes searched his, a tear slipping free, not from sadness, but from a joy too vast to contain. He signed, haltingly, the words he'd practiced alone in his workshop for weeks, his hands clumsy but earnest. "Marry me." Her breath hitched, tears spilling, her hands reaching for his, her nod quick and certain. She leaned in, kissing him, gentle but sure, her fingers framing his face, her touch a vow of its own. No words were spoken, no crowd bore witness, but in that sunlit workshop, something unbreakable took root. A love that needed no voice, a bond deeper than sound, a promise that held against the world. They married that summer under the pines, the air warm and thick with the scent of sap, the clearing alive with birdsong. The deputy, Barrett, and his wife, Martha, stood as witnesses, Martha bringing a basket of wildflowers that Eliza tucked in her hair, their petals soft against her cheek. She wore a simple dress she'd sewn herself, its hem embroidered with tiny leaves, a nod to her carvings, a symbol of her roots in this new life. Nathan had built a new room onto the cabin, its walls etched with her designs, vines and stars, a story of their beginning. The ceremony was quiet, the vows written and signed, their hands entwined as Barrett read from a tattered Bible, his voice steady despite the dust in his throat. Martha wept, her handkerchief crumpled, and even Barrett's eyes shone. Bitter Creek's gossip had faded, replaced by grudging respect for the couple who'd faced down trouble and built something beautiful, their work a testament to their strength. Eliza and Nathan faced hardships together, lean winters when orders were scarce, a storm that damaged the workshop roof, a fever that swept through town and left them both weak for weeks. They rebuilt the roof stronger, tended each other through illness, and laughed when orders piled up faster than they could carve. They argued sometimes, over money, over Nathan's stubbornness when he worked too long, over Eliza's insistence on doing too much despite her own limits. But their fights ended in laughter and signed apologies in quiet moments by the fire where words weren't needed. They planted a garden, Eliza tending herbs and flowers, Nathan teasing her about her ruthless wedding, his grin wide when she flicked dirt at him. They adopted a stray dog, a scruffy mutt Eliza named Scout with a sign she invented, and he followed her everywhere, his tail a blur when she carved. Years later, the cabin stood stronger, its walls weathered but warm, a new porch added where they sat on summer evenings, watching the stars, Scout sprawled at their feet. Eliza's notebook grew thick with sketches and notes, a record of their life. Nathan splitting wood, the garden in bloom, the curve of the hills against the sunset, Scout chasing a rabbit. She wrote one night, as they sat together, the fire low, the air soft with June's warmth. "I was lost. You found me. We built this." Nathan read it, his eyes soft, and signed home, then kissed her forehead, his touch a language of its own. They'd added a second room, a small studio for Eliza's carvings, its shelves lined with her work, boxes, spoons, a cradle they hoped to fill one day. Her art spread across Wyoming, Then beyond, a gallery in Denver displaying her pieces, a newspaper calling her the silent sculptor of the West. Nathan's furniture, bearing her designs, sat in homes from Cheyenne to San Francisco, their partnership a legacy in wood and love. They faced new challenges, droughts that dried the garden, a fire that nearly took the workshop, a winter so harsh Scout barely left the hearth. But they endured, their hands joined, their hearts steady. Eliza taught sign to children in town, her classes small but growing, her silence a bridge rather than a barrier. Nathan built a school desk for her first student, a girl who'd lost her hearing to illness, and Eliza wept when she saw it, her fingers tracing the carved flowers along its edge. They grew older, their hair graying, their hands slower but no less skilled, their love deeper with each year, a river carving stone. In a world that had pushed her aside, Eliza had found her place. Not just in a carpenter's cabin, but in a love she'd earned, a strength she'd always carried, a life she'd shaped with her own hands. Her silence was no longer a lack. It was a space where she was heard, where she spoke in ways that mattered most. Through signs, through carvings, through the quiet certainty of her presence. And in that silence, she and Nathan wrote a story that would outlast the snow, the storms, and the years. A testament to two souls who chose each other against all odds, who built a home not just of wood, but of courage, trust, and a love that spoke louder than words ever could.